Imagine for a moment that the story of Jesus you've always known is only a fragment, just one page torn from an ancient manuscript whose full contents were deliberately hidden. Imagine that buried beneath centuries of doctrine and dogma lies a secret so powerful it could shatter everything we thought we understood about divinity, humanity, and our own potential. What if the true message of Jesus had little to do with blind obedience or fear of damnation, and everything to do with awakening your own divine nature? In this video, we will uncover a hidden dimension of Jesus's teachings, one so radical, so empowering, that early religious institutions moved swiftly to suppress it. We will journey through lost texts, forbidden scriptures, and esoteric wisdom that paint a very different portrait of the Christ, a teacher of inner transformation, a revealer of cosmic truths, and a guide to divine realization. This is not just a historical investigation, it is a spiritual awakening, and I promise you the final revelation we'll explore is the most powerful of all. Stay with me, because by the end of this journey you will not only see Jesus in a new light, you will see yourself in a new light. Before we dive deep into this sacred mystery, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment with your thoughts or questions as we go. Share this video if it resonates, because these truths were not meant to be buried. Hidden knowledge is rising, and you are part of the awakening. Prepare yourself, because what you're about to hear may change the way you understand your life and the universe forever. Let's begin. The Jesus most people know is a figure formed through the selective preservation of certain texts and the deliberate suppression of others. The New Testament, as we know it, was not handed down fully formed from heaven. It was shaped, filtered, and chosen by powerful councils in the 4th century, most notably the First Council of Nicaea in the year 325. Under the reign of Emperor Constantine, Christianity was no longer a persecuted sect. It was a political tool, and in transforming it into the state religion of the Roman Empire, certain narratives were promoted, while others were burned, buried, or labeled heretical. But fragments of those forbidden teachings survived, whispers of an older, deeper Christianity. In the deserts of Egypt in 1945, a discovery was made that would shake the foundations of biblical scholarship, the Nag Hammadi Library. Inside clay jars were dozens of ancient texts, untouched for over 1,600 years. Among them, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. These writings offered a Jesus far different from the one we encounter in church sermons. This Jesus did not call for external worship. He invited us to go within. The Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, begins with a bold proclamation: "Whoever finds the meaning of these words will not taste death." It's not about salvation through a blood sacrifice. It's about Gnosis, direct personal knowledge of the divine. Jesus becomes a mirror, not a mediator. He says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you." This is a fundamentally esoteric message, one that aligns with the Hermetic traditions, with Eastern mysticism, and with the teachings of ancient mystery schools. It tells us that the divine is not locked in the heavens, but nested within the soul of every human being. But such a message is dangerous to institutions that seek control. A man who knows God dwells within him cannot be dominated. Ask yourself, why would the early church, which claimed to protect the teachings of Christ, go to such lengths to silence these texts? Why would the voice of Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus's closest disciples, and, according to some sources, the one who understood his message most fully, be erased and her name maligned as a prostitute? Why were these powerful and mystic gospels excluded, branded as heresy, and destroyed wherever they were found? The answer is as old as power itself. The message of the inner Christ empowers the individual. It renders priests' hierarchies and rituals secondary. It collapses the outer temples and rebuilds them in the heart. In this radical version of Christianity, salvation is not something handed to you, it's something awakened within you. Throughout the Gospel of Philip, we find repeated emphasis on sacred union, both the divine union of masculine and feminine energies and the spiritual union of the seeker with the Christ consciousness. It speaks of mysteries too deep for literal minds. It says truth did not come into the world naked, but in types and images. Jesus, in these texts, teaches in symbols, metaphors, and paradoxes. Why? Because the truth cannot be contained in mere words. It must be experienced, And yet, how many have been told not to question, not to seek, not to turn inward? How many have been taught to fear their own inner voice? Here lies the true tragedy and the beginning of liberation. Because the very texts that were buried now rise again. The lost words of Jesus call out across the centuries, beckoning to the soul ready to remember. And as we begin to understand what was hidden, we also begin to understand why it was hidden. The secret is this: Jesus was not just trying to save the world, he was trying to awaken it. He spoke of a kingdom, not as a place we go after death, but as a state of consciousness. The kingdom is within you, and it is outside you, he says in Thomas. Split a piece of wood and I am there. Lift the stone and you will find me. This is the language of unity, of oneness, of Christ consciousness. And perhaps the greatest heresy of all, the one the Church could never allow, is this: Jesus did not claim to be the only Son of God. He taught that we are all children of the divine. You will do greater things than I, he says. Can you feel the power in those words? The implications are staggering. If Jesus came not to be worshipped, but to show the way, then the path he walked is a path we are meant to walk ourselves. He becomes not an idol to adore, but a model to follow, a map of human potential fully realized. But if we are divine in origin, capable of inner revelation and union with the source, then we are no longer easy to manipulate, no longer dependent on external authorities for access to the sacred, no longer subject to systems of control that thrive on spiritual ignorance. Now I ask you, why do you think these teachings were hidden? Why do you believe certain books were canonized and others erased? What would happen if millions of people suddenly remembered the spark of divinity within themselves? Let that question echo in your soul. The erasure of these sacred texts and the distortion of Jesus' message was not an accident of history, it was an intentional act of spiritual suppression. But despite centuries of censorship, truth has a way of resurfacing. Like seeds buried deep in the ground, these ancient teachings have begun to bloom once more in the consciousness of seekers around the world. You may be one of them. You feel the stirrings of something greater within you, an ancient memory awakening. You sense that what you were taught about God was only a fraction of the truth, and now the rest is calling. One of the most significant suppressed elements of Jesus' message is the idea of Christ consciousness, a level of awareness that transcends the personal ego and unites the individual with the divine source. In this understanding, Christ is not simply Jesus' last name, nor is it a title exclusive to one man. It is a state of being, a sacred vibration, an inner light that dwells in every soul waiting to be remembered. Jesus embodied it fully, but he never claimed a monopoly over it. In fact, he encouraged others to awaken it within themselves. This is why the Gospel of Thomas does not describe miracles or historical events. It transmits keys to inner transformation. Jesus says, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inner as the outer, and the above as the below, then you will enter the kingdom." This is alchemical language. It is hermetic, it is mystical, and it was meant for those ready to see with the inner eye. These teachings find resonance in ancient traditions across cultures. The Hermetic maxim, "as above, so below," echoes through the sayings of Jesus. The Upanishads of India speak of the Atman, the divine self within, that mirrors the supreme Brahman. In Buddhism, we are told that the Buddha nature is in all beings. And here too, in these long-forgotten Gospels, Jesus teaches the same, that divinity is not something you must earn through obedience. It is something you remember through awakening. But to awaken this inner Christ, one must go through a process of death and rebirth, not physical but spiritual. The ego must dissolve, the illusions must fall, and the soul must emerge naked in the light of truth. This is what the early Gnostic Christians meant by Gnosis, not belief but direct knowing, not external ritual but internal realization. And this is why the Church, once allied with empire, feared them, because the Gnostics did not need a priest to access God. They did not require a cathedral to feel holy. Their temple was the body, their altar was the heart. Their gospel was written in the soul. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, a text found in fragments in the 19th century, Mary emerges not as a passive follower, but as a spiritual equal to Jesus. In fact, after his death, it is she who comforts and teaches the other disciples. When Peter questions her authority, She replies not with arrogance but with revelation, recounting visions she received from the Master himself. He told her that the soul must pass through 7 stages of liberation to return to the divine. These are inner realms, not of the afterlife but of consciousness. Mary Magdalene's voice was silenced because it threatened a patriarchal structure. Her gospel was buried because it revealed spiritual truth accessible to all, including women, especially women. But now, her voice rises again. She represents the divine feminine, the lost counterpart to the masculine logos. And only when these two are united within us can the full light of the Christ awaken. Let us reflect on this. What if salvation was never about escaping this world, but about transforming it? What if the crucifixion was not a payment to an angry God, but a mystical initiation? What if resurrection is not only a past event, but an ongoing inner process? In the Gospel of Philip, we find a powerful line. Those who say they will die first and then rise are in error. If they do not receive the resurrection while they live, when they die they will receive nothing. This is not metaphor. It is the heart of the mystery. Resurrection is now, awakening is now. The veil is thin and you are standing at the threshold, and yet even today mainstream religious structures resist these truths. They insist on obedience, hierarchy, and fear. But the teachings of Jesus in these secret gospels are not about fear, they are about freedom, not about damnation, but about illumination. Ask yourself now, have you ever felt the presence of the divine within you? Have you sensed that you are more than flesh and blood, that there is a sacred spark within you that longs to be known? If so, you are hearing the same call that stirred the mystics, the saints, and the ancient initiates across time. That call is the voice of the Christ within, not calling you to worship, but to awaken. This is the reason the early mystic Christians were hunted and silenced. They knew the path was not through blind faith, but through inner experience, through the mysteries, through the marriage of spirit and matter, heaven and earth, light and shadow. And what of the miracles of Jesus? In these hidden texts, we learn that the true miracle was not walking on water or turning water into wine. It was transforming human consciousness, elevating the mind to the divine, revealing the sacred within the ordinary. Everything he did was to demonstrate what is possible for you. He said, "You are the light of the world," not because he was flattering us, but because he knew who we are beneath the veils of illusion. So now, as we peel away these veils, as we recover these forbidden truths, something powerful begins to stir in the collective soul of humanity. The image of Jesus is being reclaimed, not as a distant deity, but as a divine mirror. And through that mirror, we begin to see the reflection of our own divinity. This is the secret the Church tried to bury. This is the mystery the Empire could not control. And this is only the beginning. To truly grasp the magnitude of what was hidden, we must look at what early Christianity was before it was co-opted by empire and molded into a tool of control. The first followers of Jesus did not build grand temples or enforce rigid dogma. They were mystics, healers, visionaries. They gathered in homes, caves, and under open skies to share teachings that spoke of inner transformation, divine light, and liberation from illusion. They believed not in salvation through punishment, but in Gnosis, the awakening of the soul. But as Christianity grew in influence, it became useful to those in power. The Roman Empire, sensing the unifying force of this growing movement, sought to control it. And so the teachings were edited. The mysticism was removed. The feminine was erased. The mystical path of inner divinity was replaced with rules, creeds, and intermediaries. The living Christ was crucified a second time, this time symbolically, through the distortion of his message. And yet, the original fire never fully died. It burned in secret among the Gnostics, the Cathars, the Desert Fathers, the Sufi mystics, the Jewish Kabbalists, and the Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart and Hildegard of Bingen. Across time and space, these souls heard the same echo, that God is not a distant tyrant but an indwelling presence, and that Jesus did not come to demand worship but to ignite remembrance. Now consider this. If Jesus truly embodied the divine potential of humanity, then what does that say about you? What does that say about the dormant energies within your own being? You are not separate from the source. You are not broken. You are not unworthy. These are lies built to keep you small. But the forbidden gospel reveals otherwise. It proclaims you are capable of communion with the divine here and now, without fear, without shame. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "If your leaders say to you, 'Look, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds will get there before you. If they say it is in the sea, then the fish will get there before you. Rather, the kingdom is within you, and it is outside you." This is not poetry, it is a metaphysical truth. It means that the kingdom of God is not a distant realm, it is a state of consciousness, a dimension accessible through the awakening of the soul. But why was this so dangerous? Because an awakened population cannot be controlled. A human being who realizes their own divinity is not a slave to systems of power. They become sovereign, radiant, and fearless. And history shows us what happens to those who become too luminous in a world ruled by shadows. They are silenced. Let us not forget what happened to the Cathars, a mystical Christian sect in southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries. They believed in reincarnation, in the feminine face of God, and in direct access to the divine without a priest. They taught that Jesus came to remind us of our true origin beyond this material world. And for this, they were declared heretics and slaughtered in a brutal crusade. Their extermination wasn't just a massacre of bodies, it was an attempt to extinguish a light. But the truth cannot be killed. It waits. And when the time is right, it rises again. That time is now. Across the world, people are awakening. Ancient texts are resurfacing. Hidden knowledge is being remembered, not just intellectually, but viscerally, spiritually. And you are part of this great remembering. The teachings of Jesus, when stripped of dogma, speak to the heart in a language older than words. They speak of the divine spark within, of the sacred union between soul and source, of the eternal light that no darkness can extinguish. And they challenge us not to believe blindly, but to seek, to ask, to knock. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Jesus says, "There is no sin, but it is you who make sin when you act in ways that are contrary to the nature of your own being." What does this mean? That morality is not about rules imposed from outside, but about alignment with your own soul. This is a radical freedom and also a great responsibility. It invites you to become the guardian of your own temple, to look inward, to purify the heart, to embrace the sacred in all things. This view aligns not just with mystical Christianity, but with ancient esoteric traditions that teach the same inner journey. In the Hermetic texts, the initiate learns that to know the self is to know God. In the Kabbalah, the tree of life is a map of the soul's ascent toward the divine crown. In alchemy, the transformation of lead into gold is a metaphor for the spiritual transmutation of the ego into divine essence. And Jesus, in these forbidden Gospels, is revealed to be not just a Messiah, but a master alchemist, showing us how to transmute suffering into wisdom, death into life, illusion into truth. Are you beginning to see why this message was buried? It does not require you to wait for a savior. It invites you to become one. It tells you that the sacred texts are not only written in ink, but in your very cells, that you are a vessel of divine light, temporarily forgotten, now beginning to remember. This is not just information, it is initiation. And now I ask you to consider, what would your life look like if you lived from this awakened state? How would your choices change? Your relationships? Your understanding of purpose? What illusions would you cast aside if you truly believed the divine lives within you? That question is not rhetorical. Reflect on it, write about it, share it in the comments. Because the act of remembering is not passive, it is participatory. This is the journey of the soul, the secret Jesus came to ignite within us. And we are only beginning to uncover the depth of what was hidden. The final revelation, the most powerful truth of all, is yet to come. And it is not just something to be understood, it is something to be felt, to be lived, to be embodied. Are you ready? Throughout this journey, we've peeled away layers of distortion and silence. We've heard Jesus speak again, not from pulpits, but from buried scrolls, from the desert sands, and most importantly, from within our own hearts. And now we arrive at the ultimate mystery, the truth so immense, so transformative, that its full realization could change the very course of human consciousness. This truth is simple yet profound. You are not separate from God. You never were. The greatest illusion, crafted over centuries, enforced through fear, institutionalized through doctrine, is the lie of separation. That God is up there, and you are down here. That you are broken, fallen, unworthy, and in need of an external savior to redeem you. But Jesus, in his purest, unedited voice, spoke a different truth, one echoed in the Gospel of Thomas, where he says, "I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all came forth, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift the stone, and you will find me there." What does this mean? It means that divinity permeates everything, not just churches or holy books, not just prophets or saints, but everything, every tree, every heartbeat, every breath you take. And yes, it lives within you. The final revelation, the forbidden secret, is that the Christ is not a man to worship. The Christ is a state of consciousness to awaken within yourself. When Jesus said, "You will do greater things than I," he wasn't being poetic. He was revealing the future, the evolution of the soul. He was planting the seed for humanity to grow into its divine inheritance. This is the sacred fire the Church tried to extinguish. Because if humanity were to collectively remember this truth, the need for hierarchical control would vanish, fear would lose its grip, and love, unconditional, unmediated love, would flood the world. This was the mission of Jesus, not to start a religion, but to initiate a revolution of consciousness. He did not come to create followers. He came to awaken co-creators, those who remember they are made in the image of the divine, not in body, but in essence. And yet this idea threatens centuries of theology, because it invites you to bypass the gatekeepers of spirituality, to go directly to the source, not through dogma, but through inner stillness, contemplation, and love. This inner path is what mystics of all ages have called the narrow gate. It is not wide, flashy, or filled with spectacle. It is silent, subtle, often missed by the outer eye, but for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, it leads to the kingdom. And what is the kingdom? Not a city in the clouds, not a throne in the sky, but a state of being, a vibration, a realization of unity. In the Gospel of the Egyptians, a text also recovered among the lost scriptures, Jesus speaks of the place where there is no male and female, no above and below, no death and birth. It is a return to the undivided whole, the absolute, the eternal. And you do not go there by traveling. You become it by remembering who you are. This is the ultimate heresy and the ultimate liberation, that the Christ lives in you, that Jesus was the prototype of awakened humanity, that his crucifixion and resurrection were not singular events in history, but symbols of the path all souls must walk, the death of illusion, the descent into the unknown, the awakening to truth, and the return to divine light. And now, this sacred path is calling to you. You are not here by accident. If these words resonate, it's because your soul remembers. It remembers the fire of truth that cannot be snuffed out. It remembers the voice of the Master, not as a distant authority, but as an echo of your own divine wisdom. The world is changing. The old systems are crumbling. The veils are thinning. Humanity is at a crossroads, and those who carry this inner flame will be the torchbearers of a new age. So what now? Now is the time to turn inward, to meditate, to pray, not in repetition, but in reverent silence, to read the forbidden texts, yes, but more importantly, to read the book of your own soul. It is there that you will find the gospel of the living Christ. Embrace your divine identity, not in ego, but in humility. For to know yourself as a child of God is not arrogance, it is truth. And this truth sets you free, free from fear, free from shame, free from the illusion of unworthiness. You were never cast out of Eden. Eden was cast out of your consciousness. Now it returns. The true teachings of Jesus were never meant to enslave. They were meant to awaken. You are not a sinner in need of rescue. You are a soul in need of remembrance. And once you remember, you become the light the world so desperately needs. Look around. The signs are everywhere. The secrets buried for centuries are resurfacing. The voices silenced are speaking again. The world is ready, and so are you. Jesus never asked to be worshipped. He asked to be followed, not blindly but consciously. He is the blueprint, the revealer, the door. But the step through that door, that is yours to take. The forbidden secret is no longer forbidden. It is rising, and it lives within you. So rise, awaken, and remember what you truly are, not merely human but divinely human, a carrier of the light, a reflection of the eternal, a spark of the infinite flame. This is the truth the Church erased, and now it is yours to reclaim. If this message stirred something within you, then let that stirring grow. Share your thoughts in the comments, share this video with others, and let this ancient flame be passed from heart to heart, because the time of silence is over. The Christ within you is calling, and this time you are ready to answer. Thanks for looking.